Welcome to the Lair of the Alchemist, where we are going to be discussing all things heavy metal and hard rock. Today's topic, 5 bands that are often called heavy metal bands that in my opinion are not metal bands. These bands often appear on people's lists when they're listing the greatest heavy metal bands of all time. Their albums appear in lists of the greatest metal albums of all time. I'm thinking of like Martin Popoff's book, The 500 Greatest Metal Albums of All Time. These bands have multiple albums on these lists, and they often get lumped into the heavy metal genre. You hear them mentioned in the same breath with bands that I would consider to be pure heavy metal bands. Okay, so what, in my opinion, makes a band a heavy metal band? Well, that's kind of complicated. Part of it is a mood, an atmosphere, a feeling that the band creates. There has to be heavy riffs. There has to be heavy guitar, distorted guitar, minor keys, subject matter that tends to focus on dark things, fantasy, intense subject matters, occult, themes that run through the band, through the album covers, the band name, the imagery of the band. These bands that I'm going to list that often get called heavy metal, they get called heavy metal because of their influence on heavy metal. And maybe they do have some songs that are really heavy. Maybe they have a little bit of imagery that is heavy. But in my opinion, it doesn't add up enough to make them a heavy metal band. For me, the majority of what you do has to lean into that heavy category to be considered a metal band. There's plenty of artists out there that have 1 or 2 heavy songs. Neil Young has some heavy songs. No one would consider Neil Young a heavy metal band. Pink Floyd has some very dark, atmospheric, you could even say doomy songs, but no one would consider Pink Floyd a doom band. Okay, so let's get into it. Here's my 5 bands in no particular order. My first band, Led Zeppelin. A great, maybe one of the greatest hard rock bands of all time. Very influential for hard rock bands that followed them and for metal bands. Jimmy Page, guitar hero, riffs all over the place, excellent production. John Bonham, one of my favorite drummers, super heavy. Robert Plant, the Golden God, he sort of defined that epic frontman with the high, super high wailing voice. But to me, they are not heavy metal. The reason why they're not heavy metal, in my opinion, is yes, they have some heavy songs, but when you sit down and you add them up, it's only a small part of what Led Zeppelin is. The first album, for instance, you could say Communication Breakdown. It's very heavy. Dazed and Confused, dark, pretty heavy. Led Zeppelin 2, Whole Lotta Love. Maybe Bring It On Home. Led Zeppelin 3, The Immigrant Song, very heavy. Okay, very metal sounding. You know, if you want an early blueprint for heavy metal, the wailing vocals, the chugging riffs, chugging riff of that song. Led Zeppelin 4, When the Levee Breaks, maybe. Maybe Stairway to Heaven for its epic quality. Houses of the Holy, No Quarter is pretty dark. Physical Graffiti, Kashmir, a heavy, epic, dramatic song to set the template maybe for what we would hear later with bands like Rainbow. Presence, Achilles' Last Stand, maybe one of their heaviest songs. But really, when you add it up, how many songs was that? Maybe 10, 12 songs that are really heavy. Their imagery, kind of heavy. Jimmy Page with his association with the occult. But again, when you add it all up, it just doesn't for me, make them a heavy metal band. And Led Zeppelin is so much more than just those heavy songs. Think of Led Zeppelin 3 with the folky influences, the blues influence that goes through all their music. Albums like In Through the Outdoor and Coda, I don't really think there's anything heavy on those at all. Maybe, I don't know. So for me, very influential band. Without them, we probably wouldn't have heavy metal as we know it today. But when you just add it all up, they're not, in my opinion, a heavy metal band. They are an amazing, one of the best hard rock bands of all time. Okay, let's move on. Next for me, in bands that often get called heavy metal that I do not believe are heavy metal. Deep Purple. I would say the Deep Purple's a little bit heavier than Led Zeppelin. Again, if you sort of stack it up, add it up. Ritchie Blackmore, one of my favorite guitar players. In my opinion, his influence on heavy metal guitar playing, he doesn't get enough credit. The scales that he used, his sound. John Lord's heavy organ, Ian Pace, heavy drummer, a lot like John Bonham. The singing, high-pitched wailing singing from Ian Gillan, the screaming. But again, when you go down the albums and you go through it, if you look at In Rock, Child in Time, Hard Lovin' Man, the title right, I think. Those are heavy. Flight of the Rat. The production on that album is pretty heavy. Machine Head, maybe their heaviest record, in my opinion. Smoke on the Water, Pictures of Home, Space Truckin'. But then by the time you get into Burn, Stormbringer, the song is heavy, but really Burn, the song is pretty heavy. But those albums, when they changed the lineup, got a little bit more funky. So really, again, when you stack it up, Perfect Strangers, if you threw Perfect Strangers in there, the song Perfect Strangers and Knocking It at Your Back Door, really heavy songs. But when you add it all up, they don't have enough songs, heavy songs, for me to consider them heavy metal. Their lyric matter tends, I love Ian Gillan's lyrics, but he doesn't really dwell much into the fantasy realm. He's more of kind of a wordsmith, clever wordplay. Then by the time Glenn Hughes and David Coverdale came in the band, like I mentioned earlier, they were more of a funky soul band. So again, for me, love them. Very influential, especially Ritchie Blackmore's influence on later guitar players that would be in metal bands. But when you just add it up, to me, great hard rock band, but not a heavy metal band. Next band, Blue Oyster Cult. Blue Oyster Cult, I would say, is maybe the least heaviest out of the 5 bands that I'm going to be mentioning. Yet, they seem to be the band that gets lumped all the time in as a heavy metal band. I kind of understand why. I think part of it is the early press for them. They got billed as the American Black Sabbath. Later on, they were managed by the same manager that managed Black Sabbath. They toured with Black Sabbath. They put out a video, the Black and Blue video. The songs that everybody knows them for, which is a shame because they have so many great songs. I absolutely love Blue Oyster Cult. I got the shirt on. But most people that are just classic rock radio listeners only know Blue Oyster Cult for Don't Fear the Reaper, Burning for You, and Godzilla. Don't Fear the Reaper has the subject matter in the minor key. Godzilla has the big power chords. Those might be two of their heavier songs. I mean, again, if you go through their records, things that jump out at me is maybe you could consider them being metal would be like Cities on Flame with Rock and Roll, Astronomy, uh, uh, Don't Fear the Reaper. Uh, Again, it doesn't. By the time you get to like the album Spectres, I mean Godzilla's on that record, but the rest of that record is just great melodic hard rock, and that's to me what Blue Oyster Cult is. Some of their lyric matter, I can see the sci-fi, the conspiracy theory style lyric matter lends themselves leaning towards heavy metal. But to me, they covered so many different things with their lyrics. Buck Dharma, kind of a guitar, he is a guitar hero. I love Buck Dharma. A lot of heavy power chords there. I would say his guitar sound isn't particularly heavy compared to Jimmy Page or compared to, what we will come later in heavy metal with Black Sabbath and Judas Priest and Iron Maiden. It's not heavy like that. Love Buck Dharma. But again, Blue Oyster Cult is one of these bands that's just a lot of different things. The Cultosaurus Erectus album, maybe their heaviest from top to bottom album. Black Blade. That album was produced by Martin Birch, who was famous for his association with Black Sabbath. And so Martin Birch also produced Deep Purple. So again, great hard rock band. I just think wrongly labeled as a heavy metal band. Okay, number 4 on my list might surprise some people. This is one of my favorite bands of all time. This is the band that got me into hard rock and heavy metal. First band that I really obsessed over, was totally into. But in my opinion, they're one of the greatest hard rock bands of all time, but they are not a heavy metal band. AC/DC. AC/DC, like I said, is one of the greatest hard rock bands of all time. But they don't have the subject matter that, for me, defines heavy metal. They don't have a lot of minor key things. When you really sit down and you go through their catalog, off a High Voltage, maybe She's Got Balls. Off of Dirty Deeds, Squealer is kind of dark. Dirty Deeds, maybe. Let There Be Rock, the song Let There Be Rock. Overdose. Those are kind of minor key sounding songs. Sin City. Nightcrawler. Maybe Walk All Over You. By the time Brian Johnson comes in, they're maybe a little bit more in the heavy metal world than they were before. Just by a little, things like Hell's Bells, Shoot to Thrill, For Those About to Rock, the song Evil Walks off that album. But again, not enough minor key stuff. You never hear AC/DC do chugging style, like Iron Maiden style, where it's dun 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 dun. I can't think of where AC/DC does that kind of thing. AC/DC to me comes from the world of blues, hard rock, rhythm and blues. To me, AC/DC is a pure rock and roll band. They have a swing to what they do. The guitars are heavy. There's a lot of intensity. There's a lot of energy, and that's probably why people lump them into the heavy metal category, because there's a lot of energy. There's the intensity, the energy. But to me, there's a swing to AC/DC. There's a groove to AC/DC. There's a strong blues root that takes them out of the world of heavy metal for me. Okay, the last of my 5 bands. This is another band. This band came out later than all the bands that I've mentioned already. It gets considered heavy metal all the time. Not for me. Guns N' Roses. Another fantastic hard rock band. I think they get lumped into heavy metal because of the time period when they came out and where they came from. The LA scene, they came out of that scene right when hair metal was at its zenith. In my opinion, they came out, gave hair metal a real kick in the butt. Guns N' Roses, to me, is more rooted in Aerosmith, another band that people often say is heavy metal that I not consider heavy metal. But Guns N' Roses is often lumped into to me, comes from Aerosmith, Led Zeppelin, that blues rock. Not a lot of minor key, minor dark sounding stuff on the record. There's a lot of energy. There's a lot of heavy guitar sounds. Axl Rose has a very heavy metal type voice, this sort of screaming type voice, maybe going back to Ian Gillan. But again, when you just sort of go down the track listing, to me, they're just good blues-based hard rock. Love all these bands, but again, in my opinion, they're not heavy metal bands. Okay, so that's it for my first episode. So let me know what you think. Right down below, tell me what you thought of my picks. Tell me some bands that you think are often considered heavy metal that are not heavy metal. There's a bunch of bands that I didn't list that I could have put on this. Maybe I will do a 5 more bands, but I thought I would just leave it at 5 for now. So thanks for watching. Let me know what you think. Hit like and subscribe and all that stuff, and stay heavy and stay metal.